Thank you to everyone who is joining us on the webinar and on our live streams on YouTube and Facebook. We'll be getting started in about 60 seconds as we let everyone get into the webinar. Thank you. Thank you again to everyone who is joining us via the webinar, YouTube, and Facebook for tonight's Social Justice in Chicago discussion, the demand for refugee resettlement. I will now turn it over to Sun-Times Social Justice and Wage Gap reporter, Elvia Malagón. Elvia?
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Social Justice in Chicago, the demands for refugee resettlement. Before we start, we want to take a moment to thank the Chicago Community Trust. Thanks to their support, all of the stories I write are not behind a paywall, but we do encourage you to consider supporting local journalism by getting a Chicago Sun-Times subscription, which includes a daily digital replica of the print product, along with any story that's published online for only $2.49 a month. And tonight we are joined by a group of people who have worked directly with immigrants and refugees. Our first panelist is Fazika Alam, who is the program director at the United African Organization, which promotes social and economic justice among African immigrants and refugees in Illinois. James Porter is the manager of communications and advocacy at Refugee One, which is one of the largest refugee resettlement agencies in Chicago. Olga Soy is a social media influencer in Chicago and a marketing agency owner from Ukraine. And she was in Ukraine with her family when Russia invaded the country earlier this year. Since then, she's been in Poland helping those who had to flee their homes in Ukraine and chronicling the experience on social media. Seema Karashi is the executive director of the Muslim Women Resource Center here in Chicago, which has been swamped for months as they've helped the local Afghan American community here, along with recently arrived Afghan refugees who fled Afghanistan in recent months. And I'm your host, Elvia Malagón. I'm a reporter at the Chicago Sun-Times focused on covering social justice and wage gap issues. For those of you watching on Zoom, there is a chat box where you can submit questions, and we will also have a dedicated time for questions and answers towards the end of the discussion. And there's also an interpretation button if you would like to listen to the audio of this discussion. And so just to get started, in the past year, humanitarian crises around the world have driven the demand for refugee services in Chicago and across the country. Since last fall, more than 2,000 Afghans fled Afghanistan and have made their way here to Illinois. And in recent weeks, more than 4 million people fled Ukraine after Russia started its invasion of the European country, according to the United Nations. The demand for refugee services comes as agencies and organizations are recovering from years of cutbacks to these types of programs. Before the coronavirus pandemic, the US admitted about 22,500 refugees in fiscal year 2018, and that's according to the Migration Policy Institute. 10 years earlier, the US had admitted more than 60,000 refugees in fiscal year 2008. So to start off, immigration policy can be one of the most complex things to understand. So Jims, can you start us off by explaining to viewers a little bit about just the process of being designated as a refugee? What kind of happens before a person is resettled in an American city like Chicago?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. Of course, the word refugee is often used broadly, not just to reference refugees, but also to reference people with similar statuses like asylum seekers and asylees, special immigrant visa holders. And so oftentimes we use this word refugee as a blanket word to cover all these groups of people, but it's also a legal word. And the legal definition of a refugee is somebody who's been forced to flee their home and can't return to their home country due to a well-founded fear of persecution. So to determine if somebody's eligible for refugee status, first the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS, will evaluate whether or not you meet the definition of a refugee. And in general, that definition requires that you're located outside of the U.S. already, and that the reason for persecution is based on race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular group, or political persecution or opinion. You also can't have been resettled in another country already, and you can't be inadmissible to the US for some reason. So those are kind of the requirements to meet refugee status. And in most cases, you receive a referral to the United Nations Refugee Admissions Program, or USRAP. That's where you're considered as a refugee. And typically these referrals are made through the UN Refugee Agency, or UNHCR. If you do receive a referral, you'll receive some help filling out your refugee resettlement application and then be interviewed abroad by USCIS officers to determine whether or not you're eligible for resettlement. Resettlement is really reserved for the very most vulnerable refugees. The first two solutions are either to return to their home country when conditions are safe, or to remain in the country where they've sought refuge. But for some folks, that's not an option. And so for those folks, refugee resettlement tends to be the solution to their situation. Of course, throughout this whole process, there's a really extensive vetting process as well. In fact, refugees are vetted more carefully than any other group of immigrants to enter the country. That screening process through USRAP involves biometric and biographic checks, which occur at multiple stages throughout the process, including immediately after the preliminary resettlement support centers interview and before a refugee's departure to the United States, as well as upon their arrival at any port of entry. So the screening process is really intense, and the screening of refugee applicants involves numerous biographic checks as well that are initiated by the resettlement support centers and then are reviewed and resolved by US government agencies. So this is kind of the process by which most refugees are admitted to the US, although there are some exceptions. As we know, some Afghans arrived as humanitarian parolees instead of coming through the US Refugee Admissions Program. And asylum seekers and folks with other similar statuses, the process is a little bit different. But this is what it looks like for refugees who have the legal definition of a refugee.
And I know we've talked about this before, this wave of really need that has come in within the past year that has really ramped up. It came at a time when resettlement agencies like the one you work for were recovering after years of dwindling cutbacks during the Trump administration, but also maybe some cutbacks because of the coronavirus pandemic and how that impacted everything. I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how it's been like at your organization as you guys have welcomed a bunch of new refugees while also trying to keep up with the pace of work.
Yeah, that's a great question. As you referenced, the infrastructure in place, the refugee resettlement program was really dismantled under the previous administration. We went from welcoming almost 110,000 refugees during the last year of President Obama's administration to virtually none the last year of President Trump's administration. So a huge decrease in refugee arrivals that was really unprecedented. We've never seen anything like that in the past, even after 9/11. Because of that, we've been trying to rebuild the infrastructure, and we've been trying to do that quickly to meet the demand. Like you said, we've seen a huge influx in refugees. In fact, our agency, Refugee One, has welcomed more than 450 Afghans in a 5-month period. And that's more refugees than we resettled in the previous 4 years combined. So in that 5-month period, we had to really pick up the pace. And in the past few months, we've also welcomed refugees from places like the Congo and Burma and Guatemala, Honduras, Iraq, Syria. So we've really had to bulk up our staff. We've increased our staff at Refugee One from about 40 people to nearly 65. And we've also had to increase our language capacity to make sure that we have Pashto and Dari speakers, folks that come from the communities that the refugees come from, so that we're able to provide them with culturally sensitive services. And then, of course, we've been doing a lot of advocacy in partnership with the folks that are here on this call today, working together to try and advocate for additional state dollars and federal dollars to help rebuild the infrastructure that was in place, and make sure that we have kind of the infrastructure that we need to make sure that we can resettle this number of refugees.
Yeah, and this question is for Jims and for Seema, because Seema, your organization has also stepped up and helped resettle some Afghans in recent months. What are you guys seeing are the biggest needs, especially now that it's kind of coming on a couple months that a lot of Afghans arrived here in Chicago and in Illinois?
Sure. So we hope to help refugees move beyond survival by providing them with the tools to be independent and foster integration into the city. So we will need to focus on some major areas that refugees need, such as employment, career path, permanent housing, like rental assistance. Mental health is the biggest issue for Afghan refugees, legal services as they came in HP visa and they need to apply for political asylum. And unfortunately, most of the resettlement organizations, as well as social service organizations, we do not have the capacity to deal with almost 3,000 individuals and apply for political asylum for them. Now, of course, community building is another issue that we need to work on.
Yeah, I would echo what Seema said. I think one of the big fears among us Afghan refugees in particular right now is, will they get asylum, right? They're here on a temporary status. And so will they be able to stay here permanently? Is the safety they've been offered permanent safety? Will they be able to adjust their status? I think a lot of folks are also worried about their family and what's happening in their home country. It's devastating to see what's happening in Afghanistan and the humanitarian crisis that's happening there right now. And so many folks that have been welcomed do have families still living there, and they're now at risk of retaliation from the Taliban. So of course that leads to additional mental health needs, like Seema said. And I just reiterate again, housing. That's one of the single biggest challenges that we have when it comes to welcoming refugees, especially in a place like Chicago, where there's already a severe lack of affordable and safe housing.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to another question that I had. And I know I've spoken to Seema about this, about the trauma that so many refugees carry just from even the process alone of having to leave their home country. Sometimes that could be a very traumatic time period for them. What are some mental health resources that are available that you all have seen here in Chicago, or if you haven't seen them, what do you think would be helpful for these communities? And that's for anyone.
Sure. So speaking from Afghan American point of view, is that mental health has been a challenge from the very beginning, due to the disparity of Afghan American therapists and healthcare workers in Chicago. So we do have a wellness program that we partner with DePaul University, and we have regular sessions. They come in and they help our clients. But what we really need, and what Afghan refugees need, is individual counseling or or having therapists. And unfortunately, it's so hard for us to find therapists. And what they went through, it's something that it's going to take a long time for them to have a normal life.
I think a lot of Afghans struggle to access quality care, especially with interpretation in the languages that they need. And this is a major challenge for all refugees, but also just for the general public. We know that there's a severe shortage of mental health resources, and it's very difficult to access them. Refugee One, like Muslim Women Resource Center, has a wellness program that provides therapeutic services to refugees of all ages. But it's important to note that we're one of few agencies in the nation that's able to do that, to provide these mental health services to refugees of all ages. Most agencies don't provide those services. And I don't say that to pat Refugee One on the back. I say that because it's a real need and it's under-resourced. We receive no federal funding to provide mental health services to refugees. It's all privately resourced. And as you can imagine, these folks have fled very recent trauma. It's not like they've been waiting in a refugee camp for 15 years waiting to come to the US, which is its own trauma in its own sort. But these folks have recently fled their homes, and the trauma is so recent that we've definitely seen an increase in need for mental health services.
And just to add what James says is that we do work with the Paul University counselors to conduct these sessions. We also provide sewing machines to our clients who are experiencing symptoms of anxiety and depression. So they may have more familiar forms of self-care activities as they did in Afghanistan. We refer our clients to individual counseling, but that has been challenging due to the pandemic, as James says. And many therapists are overwhelmed right now because of the pandemic. And then we have just one therapist who works as a pro bono with us. And really, we need at least 2 or 3 therapists just to work with our clients at our office.
If I may, I really want to echo what both James and Seema said around mental health resources in the city. We have very similar challenges with our community, finding culturally appropriate therapy, providing that one-on-one, having the language ability, and then, the fear of, stigmatization, right? There's still a lot of fear around being labeled as somebody needing mental health services that our community members find very challenging. And we've had the same struggles around finding the resources to provide mental health services to our community members. And, we recently became a welcoming center in the state of Illinois. And we're hoping some of those resources will help us provide mental health services to the families that we serve.
And talking a little bit about some of the things refugees need, especially, when they're initially here for the very first couple of months, a reader had asked about what are some strategies to help refugees get gainful employment that, is hopefully above the minimum wage of here in Chicago. Are there any strategies that you guys have seen have helped, or any kind of cases, without saying the individual, that have been somewhat of a success story for you all?
Yeah, I think employment is probably second to housing, one of the biggest challenges that we've faced in recent months, especially as we've welcomed such a large number of Afghans. Refugee resettlement it's been victim to a lot of back and forth in terms of policy, right? And so we've seen arrivals go up and down over the years, depending on the administration. But this is really a long-term game. It takes relationship building, it takes expertise, it takes institutional knowledge. And these are things that were torn apart when the refugee resettlement program was dismantled. And so now we're trying to rebuild those relationships with landlords. That's a long-term game. It doesn't come quickly. You have to reach out to landlords and employers both to try and, explain to them why employing refugees is important, explaining that refugees make really good employees, that they're very dependable and that they're eager to prove themselves in their first job here in the US. Many of them haven't had the opportunity to work before, especially if they've come from refugee camps. So I think, it's a lot of it's about relationship building and making sure that we can establish those relationships with employers and maintain them and have them continue to hire refugees. So that's one strategy that we're employing at Refugee One, but I know it's a challenge as people are still resourcing their employment programs, still trying to find enough staff to build those relationships and make sure that we have good employment opportunities in place for folks when they arrive.
We reached out to our partners because we don't have an employment program. We mostly place our families to minimum wage jobs, but we reached out to Chinese Mutual Aid Association, which is one of our partners, and they have a workforce program, which is much larger than what we have. So they will be helping them with resume writing, interview, and many, and also they have a lot of access to employment. So that is our strategy, but we are still working on, building that relationship with other organizations and also private corporations.
I think likewise for us, it's been about rebuilding as businesses also are rebuilding themselves, following the pandemic. I think it's been about developing, rebuilding those relationships with employers to be able to gain access to those jobs. So it's slow, but we're hopeful that one family or one community member at a time that will be able to do that.
Yeah, and someone in the chat had mentioned that this person helps out with refugees on the South Side where there are even less organizations present there. Do you guys know of any, as we're talking about helping refugees get a good paying job, getting better housing, do you guys know of any sort of resources or maybe organizations that maybe they could partner with that might assist them?
I will say, we've had good outcomes with organizations like Upwardly Global, of course, and there's also an organization on the South Side called One on One that has been really helpful in helping us place our community members in decent paying jobs. So those are two organizations that I can think of that have been really helpful.
Yeah, I think it's definitely true that there are far fewer resources on the South Side for refugees. Most refugees, when they're first resettled, are resettled in the north side of Chicago, kind of in the West Ridge and Rogers Park area, even into some of the first northern suburbs like Evanston and Skokie. But that's where a lot of the social services that are geared towards refugees and immigrants are located. And for that reason, folks in other parts of the city don't have as good of access to those types of services. Another organization that I would just like to point to, because I know they do really great work, is a very small community organization called Hyde Park Refugee Project. And Hyde Park Refugee Project is partnered with Refugee One to welcome families. They provide employment assistance and tutoring and after school care and so many different resources, all through a pool of community volunteers. And so it's really amazing to see the work they've done in partnership with resettlement agencies to make Hyde Park a welcoming place for refugees.
I want to shout out the person that put it in the chat about Phalanx Family Services. They're on the far South Side. Sorry, I forgot to mention them, but that's a great organization that definitely assists. I don't know how many of their clients are refugees, but they have a really amazing workforce program that I think our organization should definitely look into, as well as other amazing programs.
And another question I had was, Jim's mentioned this about how refugees are also sort of like people who are seeking asylum. Last summer, we saw one of the things that happened was that there was this wave of Haitians who were trying to seek asylum at the southern border, the border with US, Mexico. But many were turned away, in part because of this policy called Title 42 that was implemented during the pandemic. But the President Biden's administration recently did announce that it was doing away with it next month in May. So Fasika, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what will that mean for people who are seeking asylum, and what are you kind of looking or what will you be watching for?
Thank you for that question. If I could go back, when the first question about the definition of refugees, and Jim's pointed out that, the term refugee is really a broad term, and, oftentimes people don't realize that asylum seekers are, the difference between asylum seekers and refugees is really a technicality, right? The fact that asylum seekers are those that are similar to what we define as formally defined as refugees, are coming because of persecution, right? But they're seeking that refuge once they get to American soil. So oftentimes, people don't think about them as refugees. But yes, we did see, the mass migration of Haitians from Latin America through Central America to the Mexican border. Many of them, did not come straight from Haiti, but came from countries like Chile and Brazil and Peru. They had left Haiti, back in 2010 following the earthquake. And because there was work, but they really lived many years in those countries, despite it being hostile to them, right? So when things didn't look good, they made their way to the border, and we saw that they were, of those people that we saw under the bridge in Del Rio, a vast majority of them were expelled back to, deported back to Haiti, and then some were expelled back into Mexico, and then a few, a small proportion were allowed into the country. But we continue to see these deportation flights to Haiti to this day, right? Since President Biden came into office, I think as of yesterday, there have been 218 flights deporting over 21,000 Haitians back to a country that is still in turmoil, right? Within the last year or so, we've seen the assassination of their president. We've seen an earthquake, and still minor earthquakes that continue to happen. We have families in the Chicago area that, have had family members kidnapped. And so this is still a country where it is unsafe to return people, but the Biden administration has unfortunately continued to deport folks. We've seen more deportations to Haiti under this administration than probably the last two administrations combined. And so it's been a significant concern. A lot of Haitians have also been expelled into Mexico, where they experience, violence and trauma. Human Rights First, for example, has reported that there have been over 1,500 cases of torture, murder, rape of people that have been forced to go back to Mexico to await their asylum cases. So the news that they are, finally ending this, Title 42 is welcome news. It's not soon enough, May 23rd, I think, is the date. Is still some time away, right? And we anticipate that there'll continue to be deportations until that date. And so it's still a concern, and there's still a lot of pushback from members of Congress and others to not end title, the rules. So there's still some concern that the administration may reverse its decision on this. And so while we remain hopeful, there's still some concern about what that could mean.
Yeah, there's several members of Congress, including some Democrats actually, who are opposing the administration's plans to lift Title 42. In fact, Arizona Senator Kirsten Sinema is co-sponsoring one of the bills. And Republicans and some Democrats have also held up the federal COVID funding bill last week by insisting that the language keep Title 42 in place. I think Fasika's done an excellent job explaining Title 42. But I think we also need to name the racism that is so blatant in the use of Title 42, because it's been used absolutely disproportionately against Black and Haitian migrants. In fact, when we started to see some Ukrainian refugees coming up through the southern border, they made an exception that Title 42 didn't apply to Ukrainians. And there's no other reason for this policy to be used in this way other than racism. It's the same racism that we've seen, in Europe for countries that weren't accepting to Syrian or Iraqi refugees, but are now very welcoming to Ukrainians. And so I think it's just, we kind of have to name that within this immigration system that we're all operating in, there's a lot of racist policies that really prevent Black and brown people, especially, from being able to access asylum and safety here in the US.
Absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out, James. And I think particularly with the immigration of Haitians to this country, there's been a long history of racism to prevent the migration of Haitians, despite the effect of U.S. foreign policy on the state of Haiti. There continues to be this this view of Haitians as not deserving, of Black immigrants in general, as not deserving of seeking refuge as compared to other groups. And it's not to say that other refugees or other people seeking asylum don't deserve it. They do, absolutely. Ukrainians that are at the border deserve to be protected. They deserve to be welcomed. But what we would like is that it needs to be for everyone, right? We should not be seeing this racial bias that discriminates against Black asylum seekers.
Yeah, and going on that, I noticed in some statistics about refugees settled in Illinois that there was a pretty good portion or amount of people who were coming from Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo. I wondered if you guys had worked with any refugees from those communities and could talk about sort of what they've been experiencing.
I'll start because we are not, unlike Refugee One, we're not a resettlement agency, so we don't get refugees that get assigned to us, for a lack of a better term. But we do have community members that do come to us because they need additional support. And so, we've had some experiences, and some of the things that we've seen is the tremendous level of trauma that they experience, not just from, most of them obviously from the experiences back home and the things that led them to flee. But some of them also come through the border as asylum seekers, and then also experience a lot of trauma in that migration route as well.
Yeah, and go ahead, James.
I was just going to say, in addition to what Fasika shared, we have a long history of welcoming Sudanese and Congolese refugees. And although, the past few months have been really heavily focused on Afghans, and we haven't seen a lot of refugees coming from these regions, there are some very particular or specific needs to African refugees, specifically those from Sudan and the Congo. On average, African refugees wait 17 years in a refugee camp before they're ever resettled. That's not true for refugees from other parts of the world. And so spending so much time in a refugee camp, many have 2 or 3 generations of families living in refugee camps. When they get to the US, there's so much more to learn about a technological society and what that means for technology they've never engaged with, navigating a big city, never having worked because they weren't able to in the refugee camps. And so when they get here, these things are all new. And that's one thing that kind of makes them distinct and separates some of their needs from other refugee groups that we work with.
And I want to get to Olga because I know we haven't gotten to her yet, but you're kind of on the front lines of all of this that's happening. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, what your experience has been like in Poland helping refugees who are fleeing Ukraine.
Hi, yes, thank you for having me. Honestly, I never thought I would be in this situation. This is something that I didn't really choose. I happened to be in the situation of trying to make the best out of it. And the first thing that, I want to say is that as much as there's so much information out there, it's also, when people are in the situation that they are currently, it's really hard to understand where to go and what to look for. Most people decided to stay in Poland, and when they fled, I was in the same situation with my mom because I was trying to find a way to bring her to the United States or to see what to do in general. Your first thing to do is to get somewhere safe, and Poland opened up the border and allowed people to stay. And so that was at least step one. And once we got to Poland, that we start looking, we went to the American embassy to find any information, and they weren't ready for anything like this to happen either. So there are not enough resources. And it's kind of hard because at least for example, I can email an immigration lawyer because I had one before. I'm also an immigrant, so I could ask her questions and see what's the best way for my mom to come, and she can answer them. But it's hard for people who are not in the same situation, not in the same position. And so every bits and pieces of information people just share, on social media, Instagram and Telegram, WhatsApp, whatever anybody hears. They're giant group chats where people are trying to find and just share any information they can. And most of the time, people just show up at different embassies and trying to find any information that's available. So, but there's just so much going on. I would love to, if you have a question, I would love to talk more about, because I feel like I can talk for an hour.
Well, maybe you could tell us, in your mom's situation, what options are you kind of seeing for her, especially? What have you been able to explore? I know that's been sort of a topic of conversation that has come up in the news as far as how many refugees from Ukraine the US is going to let in. So I wondered, what is your mom's options and what are you all thinking of doing?
Yeah, so everything's changing constantly. And, we came to Poland in the beginning of March. And in the very beginning, I think Canada was the first one I was looking at Canada because it's closer to the States. So Canada said that I think March 3rd, they came out with a statement that they will find a way to accept a lot of Ukrainians. And it took them 2 weeks. And they did say that right away, that it's going to take a while. It just doesn't happen that, somebody comes up with something like the country and then they just make it happen. And I think a lot of people are confused in that way, because I received a lot of messages when President Biden came out with 100,000 number, that he said that he will, allow Ukrainians to enter. And immediately my Instagram blew up and everybody was saying, oh my God, your mom can finally come. Did you hear? And I'm like, the thing is, there's no details. There really isn't anything right now. Besides, the only way people are coming is through the border in Mexico, which is also a very, it's still very unknown what the status is. Like they're crossing, they're getting a white card. It's only for 1 year. It doesn't really give you anything. You're not going to get like a work permit or anything like that. So it does let you stay in the country for a whole year, which is, a huge privilege to have, obviously, but also for my mom, like I want her to be able to start working. I want her to be able to go back and forth to Ukraine. So there's so many different things like that. And, right now, I don't want her to be standing in a huge line trying to cross through Mexico. So right now we're just kind of waiting to see what the details would be in the future. And it's just this waiting period. And I understand that, it takes time, but a lot of people are settling in other countries right now, and just because there's no, there are really no details. So I know that some of my friends in Chicago have already met families from Ukraine and welcomed them and also helped them that crossed the border, and everybody has different stories how they crossed. Somebody said that they were totally fine and the process wasn't as hard, and they were able to get pretty fast within like one day. And then other people said stories that everything got taken away from them, and they like their suitcases and everything. So there's no clear path, and that's why I don't want to risk it and take my mom through the border, and because there's going to be nothing in the future that is solid and guaranteed. But other than that, I talked to the lawyer, and she did say that there are ways to apply for the asylum, and for the refugee status. And what you guys have mentioned in the beginning is that you have to go through UN, and then there's an application, and it's a long process. And she also did mention that in the recent years there hasn't been that many cases processed, and she pretty much didn't really recommend that route because it is a really lengthy process. So we're just waiting and just considering other options like Canada right now.
Yeah, and you mentioned it kind of sounds like everyone is sort of like crowdsourcing how to, what to do next. And I noticed, on your Instagram, you kind of like show, it kind of looks like it would be pop-ups of like helping, refugees who are in the area that you're in. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and how just like your daily life has been there.
Yeah, so Poland has been amazing with the amount of help that everyone has been receiving is just insane. People are volunteering nonstop. Just regular people. I'm on all of these different Facebook groups, and somebody posts something that they need, even like a stroller for a mom, little things like that. And I'm always like monitoring to see what I can do if I can help somebody. But sometimes you go on the post and 5 minutes later, the problem's already solved. So people have been just incredible. The thing that I am kind of seeing also is there's so much help, but there's also everybody's helping in like a small ways. There's no really like one large thing. And I've had people from the United States contact me because some people want to, travel and be here at the border or in Poland, helping people. And they're asking me, who can we talk to? Like, where do we sign up for this? And there's no one solid structure. There's really not that many. I don't even know most of the time that like what I'm going to be doing the next day, because there's so much help needed and everybody's overwhelmed, but also there's like no one organization that is doing one thing. So it's just bits and pieces, and everybody's trying to do as much as they can every single day. But also it's really hard to navigate in the pool of different smaller types of organizations trying to do as much as they can. But other than that, it has been, very amazing to be doing good things for people. Again, it wasn't my choice. I wasn't sitting in Chicago and thinking, oh, I should just go and volunteer. It's something that once after a week, you're in Poland and you see that people need help, and especially there's a huge language barrier, so not a lot of people can speak both Polish and Ukrainian, and not a lot of people can speak English even. So I'm doing that as well. I can be in the middle and then talk to people in Poland that speak English. And so right now, like yesterday, 2 days ago, I think I'm like mixing my days, but we're just standing at the arena here in Krakow because the UN came out with the new help for refugees. So I think they're giving out 700 zlotys, which is about $190. So pretty much everybody who is in Krakow right now is lining up to get that money. And there's so many people. I saw the recent poll was that Krakow's population increased by 20% with these past 2 months, not a month and a half, which is crazy. So the cities have definitely overcrowded, and people are still coming every day. So.
And have you been able to get in contact with any relatives or friends that might have stayed in Ukraine?
Yeah, my dad is still in Ukraine. Most of my family is. My mom is with me in Poland, but pretty much everybody else have stayed. My family is in Kherson, which is the occupied territory, and my aunt was successfully to leave with her children, and now I'm still waiting to see what's going to happen with my dad because he's also trying to leave, and the issue is that there's no green corridor, so they are having like different block posts, and it's just Russian military not letting people out of the city. So like I've mentioned before, people have been very smart with sharing information, and they're just kind of sharing, like if the road is not bombed and like if there's a way to get out of the city, which is just amazing. And just seeing how people are coming together and are ready to just share everything they can with each other, and how much information is getting shared is very interesting.
Yeah, and when I often write about refugees, some of the emails that I always get are like, oh, I want to help, or like, oh, I have this or that I want to donate. So I wondered if we could just kind of go around the virtual room and talk about, what are some ways for people who want to get involved to help these communities, either here in Chicago or maybe even abroad.
I can say that the World Central Kitchen for sure has been amazing. From what I see every day, I have worked with them, I've volunteered with them. There are tents with hot food, and that's like the big organization that I know and I trust. And like I said, they've been since here, like from the very beginning. Other than that, I think that's something that I'm running into a lot is people are asking me where they can donate money to, and usually it's like smaller organizations. Like the other day I went to this little warehouse, and it's not even like a registered volunteer center or anything, but it's just a group of people who gathered and are distributing food daily. So there are certain places that I have to check first, and then I'm able to post on my social media that are trusted resources. But I would say if there's a way to donate, there's like several smaller organizations. Like there's one called Help Razum, but honestly, if somebody wants to donate, like the research has to be done. Unfortunately, it's hard to just like everybody wants to donate to Red Cross, and that has been a thing as well, which I'm not going to go into. But everybody wants to donate to bigger organizations, but what helps is to go directly to small ones where you can see that people are doing reports and they're on the ground helping and like showing it, either via social media or somewhere on the website that they're posting. But like everybody should pretty much like do the research, honestly.
I can say a little bit about ways to get involved here in Chicago. Of course, if you want to volunteer or if you want to contribute financially, there's a lot of great organizations that you can donate to. I'd recommend Refugee One, of course. I'd also recommend SEMA's organization, the Muslim Women Resource Center, and United African Organization. are all really, really great organizations doing on the ground work with refugees. You can also look, all three of us actually are members of a coalition called the Refugee Action Network. And Refugee Action Network is an advocacy coalition. And we have our members listed on our website. It's a list of about 30 different member organizations, all of whom support refugees in one capacity or another. So again, it does take some research, but if you want to look on our website and see which organizations are nearest to you, which ones are in line with what you want to support, that's a great resource for looking for opportunities to volunteer and donate. The other thing that I would just add is advocacy. I think that advocacy is an incredibly important way that people can step up to help refugees. You know, sometimes we want that experience of working alongside a refugee or having a volunteer experience or donating a piece of furniture or something. But sometimes all we really have to do is pick up the phone and call our members of Congress. And so that's the last invitation that I'll leave for people. If these issues are important to you, if you want to make a difference for Afghan refugees who are here in the US, for Ukrainian refugees who are coming to the US, for Haitian asylum seekers, for all of the refugees and asylum seekers that are trying to come to the US, call your Congress people, call your members of Congress and ask them to make policies that are more welcoming to refugees. One thing I'd encourage people to do right now, and there was a question about this in the chat, is ask your Congress people to pass the Afghan Adjustment Act. Right now, as we've talked about tonight, many of our Afghan neighbors are here on temporary status. And unless Congress passes an Afghan Adjustment Act, we'll have to file asylum claims, which is an uncertain process and very difficult process. So that's one way you can take action today. You can call your legislators. I'll enter a phone number in the chat that you can call the Congressional Switchboard in Washington, D.C. You don't even have to know who your legislators are. You can just ask to be connected with them based on your zip code. So that number is 202-224-3121. And I'll put that in the chat as well.
Honestly, I think Jim summed it up really well, how people can support the work, volunteer, financial support is always welcome, but advocacy is also huge. Thank you, James.
Seema, anything you would like to add about, you know, the individuals or families that you guys are helping right now?
Right. I think James has said it all, but if you're a law student, we would love to have you guys as volunteers because we really need a lot of volunteers who has experience, either attorneys, immigration attorneys, or law students. We also, if you guys have cars that you're not using it, we would love to have them because there's a lot of our families that does not live close to transportation and they have jobs, but it's so hard for them to go to their work, and they always ask us if we can donate a car for them. And then, of course, another thing that I think Jim's organized, all of us, we need is rental assistance for our clients, and that could be directly, given to them. And you guys could sponsor a family like that.
Yeah, and because the question sort of about the legal status, the families that you guys are working with, Seema, do you know, can you kind of give us an idea of what is their legal status?
As James mentioned, many of the Afghan refugees that are here, they're here in humanitarian parole, which means that they're only here. James, please correct me. They're here because TPS has passed. So I think they have 18 months for them to apply for political asylum. We do work with 6 legal organizations, and each one of them, they work 24 hours with us. Today we had a workshop. We had 12 attorneys in our office, but that's not enough because the length of the application is so long. And we have about 175 families that are waiting. They're on our waiting list. So applying for political asylum does take a lot of time from our staff, from the attorneys, and also from the legal organizations. So the more we work with universities, University of Chicago, Northwestern, UIC, DePaul, they're trying to help us, but it's a lot of work.
And I know we're coming close to the end of our time, so I want to get to some of the questions people had submitted. Someone had asked about children who, are refugees. and what kinds of programs are available to them. They asked about specifically Chicago Public Schools, but if there are any other programs that you guys know about to help students or children who, English isn't their first language.
So we work with Chicago Public Schools around our neighborhood, which is Rutgers Park. They all have bilingual programs. They have ESL programs. What is a little bit difficult for us is that we just moved them out from the hotel, and in 2 months the schools will be closed. So we have asked if they have summer programs, if they have ESL programs or after school programs, and we are still waiting to see what they have. But there are some organizations around our area that have summer programs. James, I forgot the name, but Shana's organization, Shana Willis's organization, you do reserve.
It's called Reach.
Reach, yeah. They have a really good programs. And I'm sure you guys have great programs, James, right? Refugee One. But
yeah.
You have it for your client.
Yeah, we have pretty extensive youth programming, everything from after school programs for refugee youth to individual tutors to help them catch up with their peers academically. We even have a summer camp where refugee youth can come during the summer and continue to progress academically, as well as building social connections, which is kind of really critical with youth. A lot of the organizations, like I mentioned, that are members of Refugee Action Network also have youth programs and provide extensive youth programming, just like Refugee One does. So yeah, I think there's a lot of good supports in place for refugee youth. I know this question, I think, referenced Sullivan High School in particular, and Sullivan is a really, really great resource for high schoolers who are refugees. They have an amazing, basically, I think it's called the Newcomers Academy. I could be wrong.
Yeah.
But it's really just an amazing program helping refugee youth integrate and adjust. It's been amazing to see some of the work they've done.
Someone in the chat also asked about resources or organizations that work with LGBTQ plus communities or individuals who are in the process of trying to seek asylum. So is there any advice you all have for them, or any organizations or resources that you all think these individuals should reach out to?
I know of one organization. It's very small and community-based. They're just helping a handful of LGBTQ asylum seekers right now, but their name is the Queer Asylum Network. I'll put that in the chat also. I serve on the board of the Queer Asylum Network, and like I said, it's a very small community-based project, but they have a long history of helping asylum seekers, specifically queer asylum seekers, adjust to life here in the US. So if anybody's interested, I can connect you with the main organizers for Queer Asylum Network.
If anyone from the audience has any other questions, now would be a good time to send those in, since we only have a couple more minutes left. And while we're seeing if anyone chimes in, Seema, you mentioned that the families you are working with, they're just now settling into permanent housing from the hotels. How has that transition been like?
They feel very happy that finally they have a home. One of the ladies told me that after 7 months, she started making warm meal for her family. So this is how hard it was. But of course, as an organization, not having a lot of capacity, it was very challenging for us. But of course, I really want to thank the partnership that we have with Refugee One. But of course, I saw Nan Varsha with RCC, with many other organizations. They have helped us a lot finding apartments for these families. We only have 3 families left, which they will be moving next week.
And will they be here in Chicago, or are they moving to the suburbs?
They're all going to be in Rutgers Park, and there are like a handful of families that will be in school. So very close to to Devon Avenue. And the reason they all want to live there because of the, shopping, everything is very close to them. So and also they feel home because our organization is there, the mosques are there, religious places are there. So everything is very close to them. And also it's very easy accessible to the transportation as well. And the schools are great.
So as we're winding down here, from the panelists, any last thoughts or anything else that you all wanted to share to the general public about refugees or in the communities you all work with?
I definitely appreciate the engaged attendees that have also been sharing resources with us. So I appreciate that. So I want to say thank you.
I also want to say thank you to Olga, because I get to work with Seema and Fasika pretty frequently, but I didn't have the opportunity to meet Olga before this. And I just want to say that our heart goes out to you and your family and your loved ones that are still in Ukraine. And really grateful to know that there's people like you doing this important work. So thank you for your leadership and what you're doing, and for being here and sharing tonight.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
And one last question we got from the audience was for Seema, if the families that you're working with right now, if they need any kind of supplies like dishes or pots, and if so, how can they get those to you?
So far, we're sad because we gave them a welcoming package, so they have dishes. Actually, we wanted them to live with dignity, and from the day one when you had an interview with me, I was really focused on making sure that they have new furniture, new rugs, and dishes. And thank God, with the help of our supporters, our donors, the state, we have received the majority of our staff are brand new, and they have it. But we have 3 families left. But the thing that we need right now, if you guys want to help, is rental assistance, direct rental assistance to our families, because they're really worried that after 3 months, what's going to happen if they're not working, what will happen.
Well, thank you, everyone. We want to thank the Chicago Community Trust for their generous support. I want to thank the special guests who joined us, especially Olga, who's in a different time zone, a different continent than we are right now. So thank you so much for joining us. Also, thank you to everyone who took the time and who's watching this either through Zoom, YouTube, or Facebook. We also know this is a busy religious time period. So I know people are observing Ramadan or getting ready for Easter or Passover. So thank you for taking the time to participate in this. And if you enjoyed this discussion, the best way, again, to support local news is by subscribing at suntimes.com/subscribe. And right now, you could get a 1-year subscription for $29.99 and a 2-year subscription for $59.99. So thank you again to everyone, and I hope everyone has a good night and stay safe. Thank you.